It started with a whisper. Late at night, when the house was drenched in darkness and only the soft creak of wood settling in the cold air could be heard, a faint murmur echoed through the hallways. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a breath of sound carried by the wind, easily mistaken for a draft slipping through an old window. But soon, the whisper turned into something more deliberate. It wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't the wind. Something was there. Cassie had moved into the old house a month ago, drawn by its charm and isolated beauty. It was nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise of the city, the perfect place for her to escape and work on her writing. But as the days turned into nights, she started to feel something strange, an unseen presence, lurking just out of reach. At first, she convinced herself it was her imagination and overworked mind in need of rest. But then the whispering grew louder. She could hear it at night, just outside her bedroom door. Sometimes, it sounded like a hushed conversation between two people. Other times like one voice muttering something unintelligible, low and guttural. She never heard words, only tones, but the sensation that accompanied the sounds was unmistakable. Something was watching her star. One evening, as the whispering returned louder than before, Cassie decided to investigate. Grabbing a flashlight, she cautiously stepped into the hallway. The beam of light cut through the pitch-black darkness, illuminating the narrow, wallpapered walls and old wooden floorboards. Nothing seemed out of place, but the whispering continued, now coming from the attic. A shiver ran down her spine. The attic was the only part of the house she hadn't explored yet. The realtor had told her it was just storage, filled with old junk from previous owners, nothing to worry about. But tonight, the attic seemed *alive star. The whispers slithered down from above like cold tendrils, wrapping themselves around her, urging her to follow. Her heart pounded in her chest as she climbed the stairs leading up to the attic. Each step creaked loudly, as if the house itself was warning her not to go any further. But she couldn't stop. She had to know. Reaching the top, she found the attic door slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that before. She was certain. Slowly, she pushed it open and shined the flashlight into the darkness. Dust particles floated in the beam of light, and the air was heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. Blood. The scent was unmistakable, even though she couldn't see any source. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that was even more unsettling. Cassie hesitated at the threshold, but then, as if compelled by a force she couldn't understand, she stepped inside. The air in the attic was colder than the rest of the house. Her breath came out in pale white clouds, and her skin prickled with goosebumps. Boxes and old furniture were stacked around the room, but nothing seemed particularly strange. She swept the flashlight across the space, her pulse quickening with each passing second. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the attic, just out of the reach of the light, something moved. At first, it was subtle, a faint shift, like a shadow stretching unnaturally. She froze, her throat tightening. Slowly, she aimed the flashlight at the corner, expecting to find a rat or some other animal that had wandered inside. But it wasn't a rat. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a figure, tall, hunched over, and vaguely human-shaped. The figure stood completely still, its back turned to her. Its body was unnaturally thin, with skin that looked stretched tight over its bones, almost translucent under the dim light. Cassie's breath hitched in her throat as a flashlight flickered, casting the figure in and out of shadow. Who are you?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure why she expected an answer. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, silent, as if waiting for something. The air around her grew colder, and the metallic scent of blood intensified, making her gag. Her legs trembled, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her feet remained glued to the floor. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, the figure began to turn. Cassie's heart nearly stopped as she raised the flashlight higher, desperate to see its face. But before the beam could reach, the light blinked out. She was plunged into total darkness. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. She fumbled with the flashlight, trying to turn it back on, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But the switch wouldn't budge. That's when she heard it. The whisper was back, louder than ever, surrounding her, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was inside her head, slithering into her ears, crawling under her skin. She could feel it, a malevolent presence, circling her, closing in. And then she felt it. A hand cold, bony, and impossibly strong gripped her shoulder from behind. Cassie screamed. Cassie screamed, her voice breaking the oppressive silence. But no one would hear her, not out here in the middle of the woods. Her body went rigid, every muscle locking in place as if paralyzed by the icy grip on her shoulder. The cold from the hand seeped through her skin, sending a wave of numbness coursing down her spine. She tried to move, tried to break free, but her body wouldn't respond. In the darkness, she could feel the presence growing closer. The whispering became louder, almost deafening now, but it wasn't coming from a distance anymore. It was right next to her, the raspy breaths brushing against her ear like a nightmare come to life. She didn't dare turn her head, didn't dare face whatever was behind her. Every instinct she had screamed at her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor. And then, with a sickening slowness, the grip on her shoulder tightened. The nails dug into her flesh, sharp and pointed, as if they weren't human at all. Cassie whimpered, a high-pitched sound of terror escaping her lips as the pain seared through her. Her flashlight flickered to life for a brief second, casting a pale beam of light across the attic floor. In that moment, she caught a glimpse of her own shadow, but there was another shadow too tall and twisted, looming over her like a predator ready to strike. Without thinking, she wrenched herself free from the icy grip, stumbling backward. Her heart pounded wildly, her mind a chaotic mess of fear and adrenaline. She turned, desperate to see what had touched her, but the attic was empty. The figure that had been standing in the corner was gone. There was nothing, just darkness, dust, and the stifling cold. But the whispers hadn't stopped. They were all around her, growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the air itself was alive, vibrating with a malevolent energy. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for the door, her fingers slipping on the old brass knob. She needed to get out. Now! Finally, with a desperate yank, she pulled the door open and bolted down the stairs, her feet pounding against the wooden steps. She didn't stop until she was back in her bedroom, slamming the door shut behind her. Her chest heaved as she gasped for breath, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. But even here, in what should have been the safety of her room, the whispers followed. They slithered through the walls, seeping through the cracks, growing louder, more distorted. She pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew stronger, echoing in her skull. Something was inside the house with her, something that didn't belong. Cassie backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. She felt trapped, hunted. The air was thick with the scent of blood again, that same metallic tang that had filled the attic. It clung to her, to the walls, to everything. Her phone. She needed her phone. She stumbled toward the nightstand and grabbed it, her hands shaking as she tried to dial for help. But the screen flickered and went black, just like the flashlight. Dead. Useless. A deep, guttural growl resonated from somewhere behind her. Cassie's breath hitched. She turned slowly, her eyes wide with terror, and that's when she saw it. Standing in the doorway was the figure from the attic. Only now, she could see it clearly. Its skin was ashen gray, stretched thin over a skeletal frame. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to consume the light around them. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, jagged teeth glinting in the darkness. Blood dripped from its fingertips, staining the floor beneath it. It wasn't human. It was never human. The whispers grew louder, pounding in her head. As the thing stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, savoring her fear. Cassie backed up against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The figure stopped just a few feet away, its head cocked to the side as if studying her, enjoying her terror. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke. "You? Asterisk, let me in, star." Cassie's blood ran cold. She hadn't let anything in, had she? Panic clouded her thoughts as she tried to piece it together. The figure inched closer, and now she could see the glistening blood smeared across its body, the jagged wounds that seemed to pulse with a sickly light. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, the figure lunged. Cassie screamed again, but this time, there was no one to hear her. Cassie's scream tore through the room as the figure lunged at her, but this time, she moved fueled by pure terror. She threw herself to the side, just as its sharp claws raked through the air where she had stood moments before. The force of her movement sent her crashing into the bedside table, knocking over a lamp. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her arm, but she didn't stop. Scrambling to her feet, she darted toward the door, her eyes wild with desperation. The figure was fast, faster than any human had the right to be. It moved in jerky, unnatural bursts, its limbs twisting at impossible angles as it pursued her. Cassie's vision blurred with panic. The room a dizzying wall of shadows and dim light. But the door was just ahead. If she could just make it out, if she could just get outside, maybe she'd stand a chance. She yanked the door open and bolted down the hallway, her heart pounding in her throat. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insidious. They filled her ears with promises of pain, of darkness, of death. But there was something else in them too, something that made her blood run cold. They were speaking her name Star. The thing wasn't just a mindless predator. It knew her. It had been watching her, waiting for her. She reached the front door and threw it open, not caring about anything but escaping. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she kept running. The forest loomed ahead, dark and menacing, but at least it was open. At least she wouldn't be trapped. Behind her, she heard the creature, its footsteps heavy and uneven, a grotesque parody of human movement. It was coming for her, but there was something strange about the way it moved, something that tugged at her mind in a sickening realization. It wasn't just chasing her. It was playing with her. It could catch her at any moment. But it was drawing this out, savoring her terror, letting her think she had a chance. Her feet pounded against the dirt as she ran into the trees, branches slashing at her arms and face. She could still hear it behind her, the low, guttural growl mingling with the sound of a name being whispered over and over again. Cassie's lungs burned with the effort, her legs aching, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when death was just a breath behind her. She burst through a thicket of trees and into a small clearing. Moonlight bathed the area in a pale, eerie glow, but the sight that greeted her made her stumble to a halt, her blood turning to ice. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling well, its stones covered in moss and decay. But that wasn't what stopped her. What stopped her was the figure standing next to it, a mirror image of herself. Same clothes, same hair, same wide, terrified eyes. Cassie's mouth went dry, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The doppelganger had double moved in perfect sync, stepping forward just as she did. "No," Cassie whispered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be." But before she could finish the thought, the double smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile filled with malice, a twisted, knowing grin that sent a shiver down Cassie's spine. The whispers grew louder again, and this time, they weren't just in her head. They were coming from the well. Low, ancient voices, echoing up from its dark depths, as if something long buried was stirring, waking. Cassie took another step back, but the double lunged toward her. "Come closer," it said in a voice that was almost hers, but not quite. It was off, distorted, like a recording played backward. "You brought me here. Let me take your place, Star." Cassie shook her head violently, backing away toward the trees. Her mind raced, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers, the thing from the attic, the impossible version of herself, it was all closing in on her, trapping her in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The doppelganger took another step closer, and behind her, Cassie heard the creature's heavy breathing again. She turned just in time to see it emerge from the shadows of the forest, its hollow eyes glinting in the moonlight, its twisted body coiling like a snake ready to strike. She was surrounded. There was no way out. "Please," Cassie whispered, her voice shaking, her body trembling with terror. "Please, I didn't do anything. Why are you doing this?" The doppelganger tilted its head, that eerie smile never leaving its face. "You've always been here, Cassie. You just didn't know it." Its voice was calm, almost soothing. "This place, it belongs to us. And now, so do you?" The figure from the attic began to move toward her again, its claws outstretched, its mouth twisting into something between a grin and a snarl. The doppelganger stepped closer from the other side, its eyes gleaming with malicious intent. Cassie's breath came in shallow gasps. Her mind spun, trying to think of a way out, any way out. The well. The whispers were calling from the well. Without thinking, she turned and ran toward it, her feet pounding against the cold ground. She could hear them behind her, the creature and the double, moving faster now, closing in. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Reaching the edge of the well, Cassie peered down into the blackness below. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, swirling up from the abyss like a dark wind. She had no choice. Taking a deep breath, Cassie stepped onto the edge of the well, her toes curling over the crumbling stones. She looked back one last time at the creature, at the twisted version of herself, and then she jumped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the world falling away as she plunged into the darkness below. The air rushed past her, the cold biting at her skin. The whispers rose around her, enveloping her, pulling her deeper and deeper into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the fall stopped. Cassie opened her eyes, but there was no light, no sound, nothing, just darkness. Complete, eternal darkness. The whispers were gone. The presence that had stalked her, hunted her, was gone. But so was everything else. Cassie was alone, and in that infinite, suffocating void, she realized the terrible truth. She hadn't escaped. She hadn't outrun the darkness. She had become it,